Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. So good to have you with us in our study on Noah's Ark. We're in Genesis chapter 6, and this message is for August 21st, 2022, but you can listen to it anytime you want. And if you were trying to find the message for August 14th, I didn't give one because I was on vacation. And every once in a while, a man's got to get away. But it's good to be back with you. And we're looking at the worldwide flood, and some people think it didn't actually happen. It's all a myth, or it's just a fancy story. Did it happen? Short answer is yes, it did. There's evidence all over the world that it did. But people in unbelief question things of God all the time, saying things like, God doesn't exist, we are not created, miracles cannot happen, Jesus' resurrection did not occur. Well, my friends, all of those things are lies. But on the other hand, you would expect unbelievers to say things like that. Now, we're trying to deal with God's people. And although God's people believe, they can sometimes get confused on matters. There's a lot of false teaching out there and false science, and we are in the world, and sometimes it's hard to not be drawn into it and be molded into their thinking. And so God's people get confused. Let me give you an example. The Sadducees were religious people. They were Jewish. They believed in the first 5 books of the Bible, but not a whole lot more than that at the time. And one of the things that they did not believe in was the resurrection. Now, they should have, but they did not. They didn't think it was taught in the first 5 books of the Bible. And so they came smarty pants like up to God, Jesus Christ, and they said a man had a wife and he died, no childless, and so his brother married this wife to raise a child up in his name, and he died, and then his brother, he died, and till 7 brothers all had her, and they died. Now in the resurrection, ha ha ha, whose wife is she? Ha ha ha, they thought they had him on the horns of a dilemma. And our Lord's answer was quite insightful. He said in Matthew 22:29, but Jesus answered and said to them, you are mistaken, not understanding the Scriptures, nor the power of God. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. But regarding the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was spoken to you by God? And this was the conversation that God had with Moses at the burning bush, which was in the 5 books of the Bible, first 5 books, that the Sadducees claim they believe and has nothing in it about resurrection. And spoken to you by God, I am the God, I am the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now Jesus answers this question to hone in on what they're missing. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. When the crowds heard this, they were astonished at his teaching. When Jesus said, I am the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac and Jacob, those men had been dead for some time. And as you remember, the Israelites had been in Egypt for some 400 years, Jacob dying very early on in those 400 years. And so, but God said, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So those men must be resurrected. They must be alive in the afterlife. And so the point is that God expects people to understand the meaning of the words, the grammar, the history, that these men had been dead, but he is the God now of them, I am, and the immediate and greater context, and the power of God. And this is what most people are missing when they have the study of the Noah and the ark. They do not understand the grammar. They don't understand the implications. They don't have a sense of history and what had transpired. They do not understand the power of God. And so we are going to look at this passage and unfold it before ourselves in Genesis chapter 6, carefully looking at the words, understanding what they mean, looking at the context, understanding the grammar, and then also the power of God. I've often said to people who do not understand the 6 literal days of creation, and they say, how could that be? How could that be? And I say to you, you need to get yourself a bigger God. Now, I don't mean that somehow or another the God that we believe in isn't big enough and we need to switch to some other God. What I'm saying is you need to allow God to expand and be bigger than your mind can adjust to. And you need to get yourself a bigger God. You need to allow God to be greater. You know, the Israelites, they had to get the Ark of the Covenant up there where a battle was because they didn't think God was big enough to be there with the Ark and then out there at the battlefront. And they used it kind of as a trinket. And what happened is they lost it. Well, God took care of himself just fine. But you see, they had God in a box. As a matter of fact, somebody tried to look in that box to see if they could see God, and God smoked them. God is bigger than we can possibly understand, and we have to expand our thinking for this great omnipotent God. So now we're going to look at the story, the true story of Noah and the ark. And I've already preached about why this had to be done, the flooding of the world. And it says here in verse 15, this is how you shall make it. The length of the ark, 300 cubits, its breadth, 50 cubits, and its height, 30 cubits. Now, the question should be, well, what in the world is a cubit? It's not something we use today. But back at that time, they had a cubit, and there are 2 cubits. There's the cubit that goes from the crook of the elbow on the inside of the arm to the tip of the finger. And that is 18 inches. But that's the regular cubit. But the royal cubit is from the crook of the arm on the outside, which is a little bit longer, to the tip of the finger, and that's 21 inches. And so the length of the ark and the normal cubit is 300 cubits, its breadth is 50 cubits, and its height is 30 cubits. So if you want to convert that to feet, and you use the regular cubit, you would get 300 cubits times 1.5 feet. That's what 18 inches is. And that would be 450 feet long by 75 feet wide by 45 feet tall. That's the regular cubit. The royal cubit is 21 inches, and just that 3 inches over 100 feet makes a considerable length in feet. And the royal cubit, if that was used to build the ark, would be 525 feet by 87.5 feet by 52.5 feet. Of the 2 cubits, the ark replica that I've seen on several occasions down in Kentucky, they use the royal cubit. So the ark there is over 500 feet long, nearly 90 feet tall, and over 50 feet 90 feet wide and over 50 feet tall. And so it's quite a structure. The dimensions of the ark make it impossible to capsize. This was determined 6,000 years before modern shipbuilding and engineering caught up to what God had revealed by revelation. All the expert engineering had already been done. Now, I just happen to have just a magnet that goes on the refrigerator. We have it there at our house, and it's got a little replica ark in it, and they have water in it, and the thing floats, and you can turn it, and the ark stays stable. You go this way, the ark stays stable any way you want. The ark just stays the way it is. And the truth of the matter is that 500-foot ark, unless it's stood up vertically all the way up from tip down, which is an impossibility anyway, couldn't be capsized. And so it's impossible to capsize. Now, isn't that interesting? That 6,000 years before we finally figured out how to make the most stable barge that could ever be made, or the largest ships and the proper dimensions of them, and the draft and what it would be for a fully loaded ship of that size, God already knew, already had the engineering worked out, and told Noah to build this stable, barge-like ship. So, the carrying capacity of the ark was incredible. Some people say, oh, how could you get all those animals on that craft, that ark? We have a lot to say about that in the weeks to come. But the carrying capacity of the ark was indeed incredible. The ark was technically a floating, mostly flat-bottomed barge. Can't say that there weren't some slopes to it, but it was primarily just a floating chest. And so this was what was being billed as a floating barge. Without sloping sides, it had 1/3 more carrying capacity. Some of these technical aspects was worked out in a book called The World That Perished. I got it from page 22. And the capacity of the ark was equivalent to 520 modern railroad stock cars. Now, I've rarely seen a train pulled past me with more than 150 or 200 cars. But this would be 520 modern-day railroad stock cars. And it had 3 decks with rooms. And so the Hebrew word means rooms. This was the Hebrew word, it means nests, which is kind of interesting. We have animals in our house, and we'll put down a little mat like this, and that's where they'll sleep, right there on that mat. Or sometimes if we have a dog that likes to get up on a bed with us, which I'm loath about, we'll have a cage, and we just open up that cage. The dog goes in willingly because we feed him at night too, so it goes right in to get his food, and sleeps there all night, and they're just perfectly fine. It's like a little nest. And they don't need a whole house to sleep in. I just need that little bit. And so they had these nests, and these nests might have been stacked and, very orderly. And the animals would go in there, and they'd have a way of feeding them, various such things. I wanted to say a little bit about the meaning of the word ark. It's never translated ship. Sometimes it was translated basket. It was used of Moses' floating basket in Exodus 2, 3, and 5. There are other words that are translated ark, but are not the same Hebrew word, but they have the same meaning, which is a chest. And the Ark of the Covenant is one of those. Roughly, the Ark of the Covenant is roughly the size of a hope chest that ladies oftentimes would have at the end of their bed, and they'd keep sheets in there and blankets and various such things, and maybe some china or something like that, things that they wanted to hang on to that they needed to be having protected. But the Ark of the Covenant was roughly the size of a hope chest, a box for storing special things. And so the Ark was never translated ship, but yet it was a floating chest. And this floating chest, therefore, was very good at doing what it was supposed to do. The Ark was exceptionally seaworthy and safe. It was covered with pitch inside and out. And it said here, you shall make a window, verse 14, make for yourself an ark of gopher wood. It was probably a cedar type wood, very resistant anyway to deterioration. It had some modern preservatives. A lot of times we like to use pine or cedar in our decks or in our closets because it has marvelous preservative properties. But in addition, they would put pitch in it on the inside and on the outside, which was waterproofing of some sort or other. And so it was a very seaworthy, very well preserved boat chest. And it would have taken over 100 years to build the ark. And as it did, it needed to last. You couldn't have a piece of wood that would crumble after 75 years. So it needed that wood that was well preserved, pitched inside and out. The ark had windows. If you look at Genesis 6, verse 16, but it says, you shall make a window for the ark and finish it to a cubit from the top. So imagine this ship, and up at the very top there were windows, air spaces, all the way around. Probably had supportive beams, and then it would end at another 21 inches. There'd be wood, and then there would be a roof. The ark had to have a roof. Rain was coming down, or would come down from the top. And so there was these windows. We don't know how big these windows were, but they were probably of some substance. I would imagine 4 or 5 feet wide, or maybe 2 feet wide all the way around. And the sunlight could come in at an angle, and as it came into the angle, an air could go in without the water pouring in as it was raining. And there was a roof overhang, and so there was some protection for water to come in if it was coming in too slanted. But the sunlight could come in as well. And I've been in hospitals, large hospitals. They have a lot of money, and they can build these big atriums, and they'll have windows up at the top, and they'll have trees growing in there, for crying out loud. And the light comes in all the way down to the ground. And so if you have a large middle atrium that ends just below, the decks end below the windows, and the sunlight comes in, and you have this large middle atrium, sunlight can come in from either side and get down to the bottom deck. And that's very important. And the reason why I have some knowledge of that is because that is the way they chose to build the scale model. And I thought, well, that's a pretty good idea. That's probably what went on. You don't get all the details of every little thing in here. This is just a grand summary. And if God could communicate to him that it should be 300 cubits long and 30 cubits high and 50 cubits wide, if he can communicate that, he can also on his own communicate other details. We know that God in the Garden of Eden had talked to Adam and Eve, and all those conversations we're not privy to. But we did get the gist of things, and this is what God does. He's amazing in what he says. He gives a large summary of it, and some of the details are not all worked out. So this is an amazing structure. And then it talks about the draft of it being 15 cubits. If you look at Genesis 7, verse 20, it's not in chapter 6. It says, the water prevailed 15 cubits higher, and the mountains were covered. Well, that just happens to be the draft, the draft of the ark, and the draft is when the ark is fully loaded, how far down in the water it sinks. You know, it's very possible for you to overload a canoe and you just get so much weight in it, it just keeps going down and down and down until the water comes over the edges and fills up the canoe. So, you know, you can get too much of a sinking. And this ship, 500 feet long and as big as it is and made of wood, would float, and fully loaded, it would only go down 15 cubits, which is less than half the height. Well, it is half the height. A lot of times you'll see ships as they're coming into port or leaving, and they have this line on them, and that is the draft line. And when they're fully loaded, you don't see that. It goes down in the water. It kind of gives an idea of how fully loaded that is, and they don't want to get too far above that line at all because then the ship becomes a little bit endangered. On the other hand, if you're too high up out of the water, your ship actually becomes less stable. So if you're in a canoe and you're sitting up quite high in the canoe, it can be easily tipped. So sometimes, if there's not enough weight in the canoe, you've got to sit down on the floor to make the weight not be so high so it's not so tippy. Well, all of this means that when it is loaded down to the draft line of 15 cubits, it's more stable in the water. And another thing that we read in there was that the height of the water was 15 cubits above the highest mountain. And that prevailed, if you do the study of it, for 110 days. And so the ark never had the possibility of running aground during that time because the draft was fully worked out, and God knew how high up the water needed to be and how low in the water the ark could be so that you didn't have some fiasco happen and the bottom of the ark get gutted. Of course, that's all coincidence. This is all revelation that somebody made up a story and they just got lucky and they figured out the draft and they figured out the right dimensions. You know, there are other stories of worldwide floods and ships, and they're all terrible craft. They aren't seaworthy and they'll crash and they'll leak and they won't last. They'll get torn up. But the one that's in the ark that's described in the Bible, perfect. It seems to indicate that this is the true revelation. And this was a marvelous working out of God's expertise in engineering. He is the master engineer, and he knows how to do things long time before we ever figured it out. Then you have a door. You have a door in this thing. And it says here, you shall make a window, verse 16, for the ark, and finish it to a cubit from the top, and set the door of the ark in the side of it. Well, my friends, this door had to be in the upper half of the ark, because the draft came up halfway up the ship, and so the door had to be above that. It would have been pretty complicated to have a door that would have been in the lower half, because you had some sealing difficulties, and water could have seeped in and eventually sunk the ship, and so you wanted to have that door in the upper half of the ark. And the animals would have come up a ramp. That would have had a dual purpose, not only to get the animals up the ramp, but a ramp also would have enabled them to move materials up to the second half of the ark and build it higher up. They wouldn't have had to have cranes and other things that would have gone all the way up to the top. They would have just had to have it half the size. And so they built the first half of the bottom of the ark. Then they put a ramp in there and built the second half of the ark, put that door in there. And so this was a massive door. And then the animals could walk up there and get in. And the door must have been quite substantial. So much so that God is the one that closed it. Now, it's easier to open up a massive door by just using the gravity. Much harder to pull it up. God closed that door. He was the one that determined the access. It says here in Genesis 7:16, those that entered, male and female of all flesh, entered as God had commanded him, and the Lord closed it behind them. He was the one that determined the access to the ark. Interesting. And, they didn't believe Noah. Only his immediate family, their wives, his wife and him got on that ark. What a shame. And, there was this man that woke up and he was in hell. And there was another man that woke up and he was in paradise, also called Abraham's bosom. There was a chasm fixed between them, and they couldn't travel back and forth even if they wanted to. Oh, Father Abraham, I'm in agony in these flames. Would you allow Lazarus to dip his finger in water and just put one drop of water on my tongue? And Abraham gave him the bad news. I'm sorry, but there's no communication as far as moving back and forth. There's this impassable chasm between us, even if we wanted to. I'm so sorry. And he says, well, could you tell my brothers, have Lazarus go back from the dead and tell my brothers that I'm here and I don't want them coming here, and they need to believe so they can, so that they see Lazarus raised from the dead, that there is life after death, and they need to be different than me. And Abraham said, they have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them. And he said, no, you don't understand. That wasn't enough for me. I didn't believe that stuff. But if they see Lazarus raised from the dead, they'll believe. And he said, no, even if Lazarus was raised from the dead, they would not believe. They need to believe the words that God has told them. And man is just notorious for discounting God's word. throwing it off to the side. Oh, that's the Bible. I'll gag. I don't want to listen to that. And they ignore it, and they seem to think that they'll have plenty of time or they can work out their way of their salvation by their own efforts. And God is saying they didn't listen to Noah. Too bad. They didn't listen to Moses and the prophets. Too bad. They didn't listen to the preaching about Jesus Christ and what he did on the cross. Too bad. I expect you to listen to my words. You know, when you're raising your children and you say to them, pick up your toys, they don't do anything. Pick up your toys. They don't do anything. Pick up your toys! And maybe finally they do something. Well, I think it's important for you to teach your children that when you say something, even without a raised voice, they should listen to you. And likewise, they should listen to God. And he shouldn't have to say it over and over again before they're believed. Today is the day of salvation, my friends. Listen to Jesus Christ. He died on the cross for your sins. You are a sinner, and you needed him to pay the penalty. He raised from the dead, showing that he had in fact done it. And he is now sitting at the right hand of the Father, having risen from the dead, and you need to trust in him as your Lord and Savior, and you shall be saved.